Well, hello and welcome. So today we're going to paint a rooster. The reason we're going to paint a rooster is because they're such good fun and they make you smile with their brave attitude, very sparky sort of character, and they're very beautiful colours. So what do we need? We need to get started with some materials. I've got my favourite brushes. I've got my watercolour paper, which I've already transferred the drawing, and I'm actually using my travel journal now because that's the only watercolour paper that I've got left. It's Arches paper. If you are unsure about watercolour supplies, I'll put a link down below where you can go and download my recommended watercolour supplies. I have my palette of paint. Now, watercolour is unique in that you can empty your tubes into these wells and just spritz them with a little bit of water, which is the other thing you need, to just wet them down, and they are good to go again. So some of these paints I've had this palette for a very long time and I just keep topping it up. So I buy my paints in tubes. I have tended to use Winsor & Newton mostly. So go for good quality paint. Winsor & Newton is a very good one, and go for nice paper. So I'm using Arches because that's my very favourite paper. It is expensive but worth it, I believe. So I have a little jar there, so I'll put the paints away. So let's get painting with our rooster. So as mentioned, I have transferred a light pencil outline of my rooster, and I've put some marks to indicate the way the feathers are flowing, because this rooster's got feathers going this way and that, which is really good fun. I'm using Aussie Red Gold pure colour here with quite a lot of water, and you'll notice I'm using my big floppy brush, which is actually, I think, a Chinese calligraphy brush maybe, or something or other like that, which I bought at the discount store. It wasn't expensive. Holding it halfway up, I'm not holding it really close. This is meant to be very loose this stage. Try and keep it as loose as possible. And to get your colour stronger, I'm not mixing any other pigment with my Aussie Red Gold. I'm just using more pigment and less water to get darker or a stronger pigment, and more water, less pigment to get a lighter pigment, because water is effectively watercolour's white. We use the white of the paper, but the more water we add, the whiter or the lighter our pigment will be. So to get a stronger pigment, you use less water and more pigment. So this one is just laying down our first layer with a fairly loose indication of the direction of the feathers. I'm using Aussie Red Gold because our rooster is quite, I want him to have that warm glow about him, and Aussie Red Gold is great for that. It's a transparent paint, so I can put another transparent over the top of that. If I put a transparent red over the top, I will get quite an orange, so it's quite good for that. Now, I'm going to start mixing the darks because he's got a very dark tail feather. So I'm using the three colours that we are using in this entire painting, those three colours together, which are the Aussie Red Gold, the Winsor Red, and Winsor Blue Green shade. So just a combination of those three to make a reddish brown or a grey brown, depending on how much blue, how much red you add to it, and just play around with those colours until you find a shade or a tone that is really going to suit you. This is still wet in wet. We're still quite wet here, and we're going to just let that combination of the three pigments just bleed into there. On his tail feathers, it's dry, so this big brush is quite good for the tail feathers because it does tend to split a little bit. As I said, I think it's a calligraphy brush, and it's quite nice for feathers. So I end up using this brush for a good bit of this painting because it just seem to work really good for feathers. So mixing up those three primary colours, the Aussie Red Gold, the Windsor Red and the Windsor Blue green shade to get myself a nice dark grey. And we will have to come back into this, of course, because watercolour always dries a couple of shades lighter, and it's quite difficult to get a really dark in the first run. So that's all right. We can have this as the highlights on our dark feathers as it dries off, which will be nice. Now don't forget to leave those little windows of white. There are little windows of light that come between the feathers. So leave plenty of those. You can always fill them in later. So keep them as many of them as possible. It looks like a pretty bad haircut at this stage, but you can add more, but you definitely can't, or very difficult to take pigment away, especially these dark pigments. They don't really want to lift very easily. So we're looking at where we can add some of this shadowy grey, if you like, to our shadow areas of our rooster. There are some areas that are quite dark, and we're really looking at the tone. We're not looking at painting individual feathers. Just concentrate on painting where the shadows are at this stage, because basically you've got your lights with the gold there, and we're just getting in some shadows basically pretty much between the feathers is what we're doing. So this is a form of negative painting, reasonably loose. I'm taking a bit of detail because I want to really capture the way this guy's feathers go flowing backwards, and then they flare forward and have little curls in them, and it's quite cute. He must have a bit of frizzle in him, a bit of frizzle breed, because they have all their feathers that look like they've had a bad hair drying day. Look like their hair's dried in a big wind. Just go carefully around their little cone, the red part. We don't want to add any pigment to that area. We want to keep it really pure so we can get a nice, strong, pure red in there. So we keep that quite clean at the moment, and just with the white. And have a look on your reference photo, whatever chicken you're using as your reference photo, and just try and pick out where we're looking at tone. So we're looking for where the darks are situated and where the lights are. Now, you're mainly looking for the darks at this particular stage, because the dark is really what will give this chicken its form. It'll have darks in some section and lights where the light's hitting its feathers in other section. In reality, those feathers are probably all pretty much the same colour, but it's just the way the light's hitting them, and that really give the form to this chicken. Now you'll notice that I've left a little section under that wing where he has some beautiful, really strong blue feathers, so I'll be using my Windsor Blue in there. And I want to keep that without any other pigment on it at this stage as well, so I get a nice clean blue happening. I'm just working my way around carefully, trying to add the darks where we need to get things a little bit darker, and just giving an indication around his cone. What do you call it? It's not called a crop. I don't know. I can't remember what they're called. Anyway, the red thing on their heads and chins. And some of these little scruffy feathers that poke out and really give some form to our little rooster. So he's starting to take shape already. So even, like we can sort of see his form there. We keep adding the darks to really build up that form. And you'll notice I sort of flick the brush around, and I'm basically, I suppose, going around feather shapes. And then get some nice, I'm starting to build up the darks into the tail feather there now, because that's a nice juicy dark that I've just mixed up with the same three colours. It's just had a bit more red and blue in it, so it got that purple, and then I put the yellow in to grey it down, so that has become a nice juicy dark. And the tail feathers were dry, so I'm going back over those and adding some more, not covering the entire thing. You'll notice there's still white paper showing through, and I don't want to cover up everything that I've already painted. I just want to add some dark and some depth to what has been painted. Some feathers I will go over completely, but the majority of it, I'm just basically creating highlights and shadows and building up form and shape in the tail feather, because their tail feathers are quite beautiful with the roosters. They have those lovely long the feathers that stick straight up, and then those big long ones that drop down to the side, and they're quite spectacular in their appearance, that's for sure. Now, while that's drying, and we don't want to fiddle with it too much, it's really important not to fiddle with watercolour, so it's good to just let it rest, let it dry, and see where we are up to. We'll go and do some of those little detail things like that little eye. So I'm mixing up a really nice dark. I've got a really fine brush. Unfortunately, it's splitting a bit. It's just a cheapy little brush, and it's not doing the job really particularly well, but I'm carefully just painting that little eye. Important to leave the little white highlight, so I'm taking a lot of care with this one and really getting carefully painting and leaving a couple of little dots of light in there, which will stay white of the paper. And just do that, and we can do that. That gives a chance for the rest of the body of the chicken for the paint to dry. So we're not overworking it, not fiddling in it, and just letting that dry off a bit. This brush did give me a bit of a hard time, and I think I ditched it in the end and decided that I shouldn't be using it. So I've tried another brush, might work. Just doing some, I don't want any water droplets or too much pigment on the brush, so make sure it's dry. You haven't got any bobs of water hanging on the metal part of your brush, so it doesn't drop down and turn this eye into a water blob smudge. So you have to be pretty careful when you're doing these sorts of details. I'll just have a drink of water while that detail's being drawn in. And we're going to do, while we've got that dark pigment done, we'll do some darks on the beak and get the line between the top beak and the bottom beak in, the shadows in around his cone on his head, and just really noting where the darks are in that area. I've decided to go back to one of my favourite brushes, because that brush isn't really doing the task. This little brush is actually an acrylic brush, but it works really good for these sorts of close details. It's a little acrylic round brush. It's a Montmartre. It didn't cost much. Again, I bought it at a discount store. I do have some very expensive brushes, but this one wasn't one. So I'm adding a bit of the Windsor blue-green shade in there, because the beak's got it's dark and light, and it's got picks up some blues in it, and it's quite interesting, all the little colours. And because that paint on the paper where I've just been testing it is quite wet, I can actually use that pigment just by picking it up and using it. I've had a bit of a cold in the last few weeks, so I've still got a cough and a tickle, so please excuse my little croaky voice here. So just getting some details in around the little beak. You notice that I often dry the brush on what I've got there is actually an old hand towel. Sometimes I will use a roll of kitchen paper towel and have that. I leave it on the roll, or I sometimes will take it off, but generally leave the roll whole, and then I just turn it over, turn over, and I get a lot of use out of that. It dries out. I can just keep reusing it as it dries, and that works quite well. But at the moment, I don't have any, and so I'm just using one of my old paper towels. Now I'm going back into its little eye with some, I mixed that pigment up darker, and in fact I think I added a little bit of Mars Black to that mixture, and a lot of blue, a lot of the Winsor Blue green shade to really get that eye nice and dark, because that's a really strong point on this little guy. So he's starting to take some shape there. We've got his nose, his beak, and his eye in. The rest of him is dry, so I'm just testing to see that it is dry. I'm going to get pure Winsor Blue and just drop in some of those beautiful blue highlights of those feathers that are tucked in under the wing, or just on the wing probably, and get some of that lovely Winsor Blue in there, because it's really quite pretty. Again, to make your pigment strong, to get a really strong pigment, so more pigment, less water, and that will give you a strong pigment that hopefully we won't have to go back in there too many times to try and work the pigment to get it to be strong enough to make us happy. Taking a little bit of time with that. Probably be a good idea to let it dry. I think I did rush into this a little bit because I was doing it for a demo, but it's nice to let that area dry before going back in there. I'm using that same Winsor Blue on his little legs, which are a grey, but the shadow looks quite blue, so I'm using the Winsor Blue. Again, it's a little bit of Mars Black in there, but other than that it's just pure pigment. I haven't done a lot of mixing on this particular painting so far, mixing on the palette, that is, dropping wet pigment into a wet paper. So I've used that Aussie Gold straight, and then that combination of mixed, that grey that I mixed up, I've used that to drop it in on the wet, but I haven't actually mixed the Aussie Gold with anything else at this stage except to make the grey. So we've got one little foot happening, and I'm just using Winsor Blue green shade and Mars Black. That's the only two pigments, leaving a few little white highlights on his leg, because their legs are reasonably scaly and they catch the light on occasion. I think the reference photo that I had for this little guy, he looks like he's got that scaly mite on his legs, and his legs didn't look particularly happy, so I have adjusted his little legs, because his poor old legs have the scaly mite in them, and they're all the scales are lifting because it's got this dreadful little parasitic mite that gets into their legs, and it's not nice for them. And this guy seemed to be suffering from that quite badly, quite a bad infestation from the photo that I saw, which was not very nice for him. I could be wrong, might be just part of the breed for sure, who knows. So just going back in with that lovely dark, so I've mixed a strong dark up now, and just picking out my shadows around my little blue feathers to really, because they are sort of tucked in under the wing a bit, so there's a bit of shadow going on in there. And I'm using that small pointed brush, and I'll go in with another round in a while and soften off those edges, but right at this stage I'm just going in with that brush. There's my small round brush where I'm just soften off one side of the edge to so I haven't got hard lines in there. The wing feathers above sort of hang over, so we've got a little bit of overlap and shadow from the wings above, the wing feathers above. And if you find that you're struggling with watercolour and can't really have trouble getting the results that you desire, it's not really your fault. It is a medium that there are a few specific tricks to, and I cover all those in my Discover Watercolour Secrets. Links to that course, online course, will be in the description below. So you noticed I touched my hand on there to feel that area that I'm about to work on is dry. I want to go into dry. I don't want to go into wet. So we're putting that same grey mixture that we made, the Aussie Red Gold, Windsor Blue Green shade, and Windsor Red, mixed up quite strong with not a lot of water, so we get quite strong pigment. We're going around the feathers, so we're painting basically between the feathers and defining the way the feathers go by the way the brush strokes go. So he has this is where his curly feathers are and where it looks like it's been blow dried the wrong way. And he's got quite a chesty feather thing happening, which is kind of cute. And in between his feathery legs, I've only done one leg so far, so he looks like a bit of a one-eyed chook at the moment, but one-legged chook. But I will do the other one in time. We'll get there. Yeah, so in Discover Watercolour Secrets, we explore different techniques in watercolour to really get the results you want. Do some practice. So we do a few little practice things where we're just basically playing with paint and seeing what it does, because every pigment has its own unique characteristics. I can tell you to add water to it, or I can not have much water, something like that. But each pigment has different characteristics. Some pigments want to run, some granulate, some are transparent, and all these things make a difference. And by doing these little practice sessions with your watercolours, and keeping the palette quite limited. So this is a limited palette. We've got 4 colours and primarily 3 brushes. And that way it really helps you come to terms and understand how these pigments behave, what they do when they mix together, what they do when you put them on dry, what they do if you put them on wet in wet. And so these are some of the things that we play around with in Discover Watercolour Secrets, along with things like doing glazes and washes and working different techniques. And we have a couple of fun projects that we do, and one of them using some unusual tools. Not really a tool, but an unusual thing to create a painting, and that one is heaps of fun. And I think anybody could do it. My grandchildren do it. They have done that course, that particular painting, and have produced wonderful paintings. So I'm sure you could too. So that one was a sunset one with some pendennis, and it's quite good fun. Lovely little landscapey one. So back to this big brush that is quite nice for feathers. I'm adding, now when I mixed up the grey this time, I added a fair bit more red. So all that's happening with this particular dark, it's either I'm taking it to the red, or I'm taking it to the blue, or I'm taking it to an orange sort of colour, so the red and yellow, or if I take it to the red and blue, then I'm taking it more towards a purple. So you can push and pull this combination to get the the tone that you're after, and so this tone is quite a reddy tone because this rooster's feathers are quite orangey, and so I'm starting to build into that dark orangey colour there. A lot of this Australian red gold that we laid down initially will probably end up quite lost. It will just be part of the highlights as we paint our feathers gradually darker and darker. But that's okay. It's still there. It will still glow through. It will still be a part of the overall chicken, because even if a feather is a yellow feather, it will have golden sort of light to it as the sun hits it in certain areas. And we're just describing the way the feathers are flowing here. So by painting around the feathers, so we're getting those feathers in by painting the shadow around them rather than the feathers, because we've already basically painted the feathers with our Aussie gold when we first put that down. So these shadows will describe the way the feathers are flowing. And we're always looking for the tones. So where are the darkest tones? Where are the lightest tones? The tone is what gives it form. It will help you describe the object. And we can forget that it's a chicken. We're looking at shape and tone. Just happens to be a chicken. Quite a handsome young fellow too, by the look of him. And he looks like he's got a little bit of an attitude as well, keeping an eye on who these invaders are, these humans, and whether they might be there to steal his hens or do some other dastardly thing to his little clutch. That's his job, taking care of the girls and the babies. Well, the mother hens take much more care of the babies, but he looks after her and she looks after them. So I'm just keep working into these feathers. Keep adding the tones. Still going with that quite orangey red. Okay, so I've just sped this up so that you don't have to really watch all the little detail of the feathers, but just working your way in there, leaving plenty of the underpainting. Definitely don't cover it all up, and keep that pigment working your shadow areas around the cone in particular, because we want that gets quite dark in under its chin. I don't know whether chickens have chins, but anyway, we'll call it a chin. Because I'd mixed up a lovely dark, I'm going back into his tail feathers again, and I'm giving some more depth to those tail feathers, adding some much darker dark. Same pigments, nothing different. It will have more of the red and the blue, and to really get a purpley dark, if you like. And we're really defining and really working into those tail feathers to get some nice dark, a nice dark glow into the tail feathers. So just work your way around there, adding darks to certain areas, particularly around these blues, because we want them to really stand out. And just work your way around the chicken. I try and work left to right so I don't get dipping my hand in the paint that I've just painted. Another little trick that's worth getting into the habit of doing. So working in there and strengthening up those shadow areas, getting the darks to really to build up that darkness and the depth of tone. And this will help give us an indication of the way the feathers are going, so we just keep working the same direction with the feathers to highlight which direction those feathers are going with all their craziness. They're not very tidy, if you like. They want to go which way and that. So he's still looking a little bit insipid, but we're getting some tone into him now, and we're really starting to build him up. Time for that other little leg, I think, because it's he's starting to look a bit funny, only having one leg to stand on. So we'll give him another leg now because I think it's time. Again, sort of go down the shape of the outside and the little wrinkly bits that come on their legs. They're sort of wrinkly lines that like around their leg. That helps give them shape and form, and it's the way that the light hits them. And again, I'm just using the Winter Blue green shade and a little bit of Mars Black. Mars Black will give me a nice dark for the shadow areas. You could use the combination of, I don't like using Mars Black on its own because it dries really flat, but if you mix it with a transparent colour like the Windsor Blue Green, Mars Black is a granulating pigment and Windsor Blue Green is a transparent pigment, so mixed together they can be quite lovely. So don't use Mars Black on its own, always mix it preferably with a transparent pigment to get some nice granulation and patterns, and so it dries doesn't dry flat looking like it's dead. There's still some life in it. So really working on the shadow of that little foot. We can only see 3 toes, and they have 3 toes, but we can only see 2 on each foot, and that's okay. It's just happens to be the way it's standing and the way we can't really see the other toes. And what the heck, if you want to put 3 toes on your chicken, put 3 toes. Go right ahead. Your chicken, you can do what you want with him. After all, chickens are about fun. So let's have some fun with our chicken, with our rooster. So up to the beak, while we're on the darks, we get this little beak to get a bit of form. Putting in the dark line, which is this, between the top beak and the bottom beak. The darkest shadow is just on the peak of at the base of the nose, if you like, at the base of the beak where it meets the cone on top of its head. And it just cools down a little bit there. So work, and I think there's a little V at the bottom of their beak that sort of goes down between the cone, or the wattles. I think they're called wattles, those things on there hanging off their chin. Anyway, whatever they're called, I'm sure a chicken expert would be able to fill us in on that, but that's not me. They're just fun to paint. So I've put in some darks, which is a combination of the Winsor Blue, green shade and black, and I'm using my round sable brush. Now this was not a cheap brush. I think I paid $30 odd for it, and probably 30 years ago. So, but I have had 30 years of great use, whereas the little cheap round acrylic brush probably will need replacing sometime in the near future. Darkening up that little eye again. Might take a few layers to get that eye dark enough to make it really be as dark as you want it to be, because it's the thing that, you know, it catches your eye. We see eyes, so worth taking your time to get it dark enough. And while I've got some dark there, I'm going to just drop in where my shadows are on that cone and wattle, if that's what it's called. So I lay it in, and it's quite light, but I'm using my little sable round brush with just clean water to soften off the edges, so hard on one edge and soft on the other, just to give an underlayer of the shadow areas of where it's darkest on this little cone and wattle. It's not a wattle, but anyway, on the bit on its head and the bit on its chin. and the bits around its eye. We want to leave some light around its eye. Because we're going to, I think we might mixing, let's see what we're mixing. I'm sorry, I paint all this, I record them while I'm painting, because I find it very difficult to speak and talk about what I'm doing while I'm painting, unless it's a really, really, really simple subject. And this little rooster is a little bit complex. I decided to have a go with some quinacridone magenta to see if I could get some red into his feathers, because he's quite reddy orange. And this proved to be not so successful, which is okay. It's always good to have an experiment. So I've just put a little bit on the brush, and I'll put it somewhere and see whether it's a colour that's going to work for this rooster. And looking at that, it's not really going to be ideal. So I'm going back to my Winsor Red, which I have to get some out of my little paint pot to make sure that I've got the right Winsor Red, because I've got paints in my palette, but I can't be guaranteed that they are the right ones. So found my Winsor Red, just got to get it open now and squeeze some out onto the palette. So we're going to get the Winsor Red and start on his cone now. So it's fresh paint, so it's quite soft. Very little water has been added to this, so I just picked up some on the brush, and I'm laying in very thick, quite thick dark paint where our deepest shadows are. And then some of this, it will go out a bit to the edge, but largely it will be pretty much in one area. So then I take my sable and just clean water and soften off that outer edge of the cone. And that will give some variation in where the light picks up on that little cone. There's lights and darks, and wobbly wibbly bits, and that will help describe the way the cone is. And if there's a few little spots of white in there, that's okay too. Now, it got a bit heavy-handed, so what I did is I dipped my sable brush into water, dried it off on the paper towel, and then I'm just lifting out some of the pigment that has laid in because it's gone a bit flat and heavy all over. So I'm just moving into another little section around his cheek, I suppose you'd call it. I don't know what you call it on a chicken, but I'll call it a cheek. And working into where the shadows are and where the darkest sections of this this cheek pattern is. Again, back to the sable brush with just some water. And this cone has got some darkness on the outer edges, darker tone that is, on the outer edge. The entire thing's red, of course, but the only way we can describe the different shapes of this red is with the tone. So this is very much a lesson on learning how to use the tone to describe something. And don't forget to leave some little bits of light around the bottom of that eye. Leave a little white rim, if you like, around the bottom of that eye, because that's where the light's picking up on the lower eyelid, the lower eye socket. I think they've only got top eyelids. Their eyes close down. I don't think the bottom part of their eyelid comes up. So again, we're just softening that off with a brush that has been dipped into clean water, and then we're using that sable brush to soften off one side of that paint. So we're laying the strong pigment down in the areas of the darkest tone. Then we're using the clean brush dipped in clean water to soften off, and that gives us a variation, and so our cone isn't just all flat in one colour. Well, so it actually isn't all flat and one tone. So it's probably all, we could say it's red, but we're looking at the tonal variation, and that will help give it form. So we're just using straight Winsor red at this stage and clean water. And we can get variation, so we can get a pretty good start to getting the form and the shape and the variation of tone just by using more or less water. So this is a really good one to practice how much water is enough water to get the shape, because there's a lot of shape going on in this little chin wiggle wattle and the cone on its head. So to get those variations in tone and where they fold and dip over, so we either using more pigment or more water, and that will help you build out the form of this little chicken's crowning glory. So I've just sped up the video here. You don't really need to watch me go through these details because it is a bit fiddly. Take your time to do this bit and really study your reference photo or your chicken to know where the folds are, what they do, where the light's hitting it, where the darkest tone is. We want your strongest pigment as you work your way around this little guy's crowning glory. And it's beautiful, healthy red cone and wattle. That's always a good sign as a healthy chook. Okay, so now I have decided to make use of that Winsor red and mix it with our Aussie red gold and make an orange to give us his lovely orange feathers. Using that big brush again and going the same direction as the feathers. The strokes are going the same direction as the feather. And this would be the same if you're painting a dog and painting the dog fur or whatever. So the strokes are going the same direction of the fur or the feathers. And we're just using fairly strong pigment, that is, hasn't got a huge amount of water in it. And we're working our way around this chicken and don't have to go details. We're not painting feather by feather. We're just getting some highlight and indicating the direction of the feathers. This is a fairly loose sort of painting. We're not really aiming for being a biological study. This is just for fun. So have fun with your chicken. Get some colours happening, get his feathers going in all crazy fun directions. Still leaving white. Still leave your whites in there because he has a couple of really white feathers on his rump. So that will be indicated with the white paper, so leave that happening. And it's just the Aussie Red Gold and Windsor Red makes a beautiful orange, quite a strong orange, which is really the way our chicken is. It's got quite strong orange on there with that little highlight of blue on his wing feathers, which is kind of cute. And, sorry, there's my head. Now it's time to really mix up another strong dark of the same three pigments as we've used. You might add a little bit of black to it. Just be careful not to add too much black to this particular dark, but you might add a little bit of dark in there, black, to get your really strong darks, because we're getting towards the end now. Our chicken has taken form. We're getting some we really want to highlight where our darkest tones are and get some details in with our dark tones, because they'll help pick out our lights. And I'm using that big brush again. Just seemed to be the brush that I liked to use on this particular chicken. Seemed to work quite well for this guy. And there's some darks around his neck to really highlight what's going on around the neck. Gives the shape of the neck and across his back to his rump. And we can go up around his head where the cone meets the feathers. It's quite strongly pigmented, quite strongly toned there. So I'm using that dark again to really get in and get the darkest darks to be really dark, because it really is a painting of tone. There's not a huge amount of form. It's chicken's just all feathers really, and the only thing that helps you describe what it is the tone. So this is a lesson in tone. It's not so much about colour. Your chicken can be any colour you like. They come in a multitude of colours. In fact, I saw a beautiful photograph of one just today, and it had it was blue and gold, and most of its feathers were blue. It was very beautiful. So you could paint your chicken whatever colour you like, as long as you get the tones right. It will look like a chicken, otherwise it would just look like a blob. So take your time, really have a good look at where it's up to, what details can be added in there to really highlight, and just pay attention around the eye and the beak that the form is correct. This is your chance to correct things if you need to. and we're just going to keep adding some darks. I decided that I wanted to get some more of that Windsor red in this chin wattle. Because it gets a bit lost in some areas there, so I'm just going in. You know, watercolour, always add more, very difficult to take it away, though I do show you a trick to take some away right at the end of this video. So stay tuned for that, because in some cases I felt like my guy had lost the shape that I wanted him to be. So we're just adding more of the Windsor red to really get this amazing cone to be really strongly coloured and strong pigment. So using a bit of that blue-grey, so we're looking at blue, a lot of the blue in that same three colours that we'd mixed up for our darks, and just basically clean your brush. It's really all you're doing to make the shadows, so we just got something to stand on. And you could call that done. But at this point I walked away and had a look and came back and decided I needed to add a little bit more. So we've added a bit more shadow of that colour there to really bring him down to earth. We want to keep our chicken on the ground. And we can do a bit of splatter. So get a brush with a good bit of pigment and tap it on your finger and get a little bit of splatter happening. And use pure colour like the colours that we've used. Don't introduce anything different at this stage. Keep the same pigments that you've been using all the way along. And you could call that done. Now it's dried, and around his wattle on his head I decided that I had too much pigment. So this little trick is something that may be useful. So we're going to lift out some pigment with a thing called a magic eraser. Now you get it at the supermarket in the cleaning aisle of all places. So it will lift paint. Some paints are really staining, but it will lift some pigment in areas that you may have got a bit heavy-handed, as I did. Got a little bit carried away in some areas and made it all a bit too strong. So I'm using my magic eraser just to lift out some pigments. There's a bit remaining, which is okay. So we had a few little feathers in there, but the majority of it, and this is just fine tuning. Like, the chicken was fine the way it was. I just felt like its head was sort of pulled into its shoulders, and I wanted his head to be out, and that was because of the tone that was going on. So the magic eraser is wet and clean, and we just use that to rub off the pigment. And you can use a paper towel to dry it, you can use your brush. And this is a way to correct once painting's finished. So now I'm going to add a little bit of the green. So I'm using the Windsor Blue Green shade and our Aussie Red Gold and mix those to make a green. So we haven't varied from the 4 basic pigments that we had right at the beginning. So I'm going around close to the detailed sort of areas and dropping in some of the green there. And that will help soften this area off with your little round sable. Take a look at it, see if there's anything else that needs doing. So I've decided to bring some more green in around that cone, and that'll help because green's complementary of the red. That'll help make that red stand out. And this is really, we don't need to do a great deal for the background, but partially because I have decided that I needed to take pigment out. This will help disguise, I suppose. Paper towel. Oh yes, so we're back with the magic eraser to take a bit more pigment out of there. Get a bit of that green happening. So I'm now going back in with my darks and really highlighting some of the details around its beak and cheek and cone and wattle to really darken the darks and really highlight to give it form and tone to describe the shapes of these funny little wobbly areas, these little wobblies. Highlight the eye and to really, this is where the character of your bird will start to show up when you get some of these darks and lights highlighting. Now your bird, even if you use the exact same picture that I've got, your bird will be quite different and its character will be quite different. And that might, you could always use that as a reflection of self or just for fun. So thanks for sticking with me this far, all the way through this fun painting of a rooster. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you'll be notified when I do my next YouTube painting for the channel. And if you'd like to learn more about watercolour and discovering the watercolour secrets, please click on the link below and pop over and check out my online course, Discover Watercolour Secrets, which is on demand online on video, stop and start whenever you like, with full descriptions and outlines, everything supplied so you can get a handle on this wonderful evocative medium of a watercolour. Thanks again and happy chicken painting.